This is Christy, and we have merchandise. Go to howtolovelitpodcast.com and check out amazing t-shirts, mugs, stickers. If you love great quotes, we have some of our favorites. If you love silliness, check out our mascot, Brain Man. Go to howtolovelitpodcast.com, click on the shop button, and find something for that person who needs to be reminded that we are fashioned creatures but half made up. Mary Shelley said that.
Hey, I'm Ryan Reynolds.
Recently, I asked Mint Mobile's legal team if big wireless companies are allowed to raise prices due to inflation. They said yes. And then when I asked if raising prices technically violates those onerous two-year contracts, they said, "What the f*** are you talking about, you insane Hollywood ass?" So to recap, we're cutting the price of Mint Unlimited from $30 a month to just $15 a month.
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See details.
When it comes to weight loss, no two people are the same. That's why Noom builds personalized plans based on your unique psychology and biology. Take Brittany. After years of unsustainable diets, Noom helped her lose 20 pounds and keep it off.
I was definitely in a yo-yo cycle for years of just losing weight, gaining weight, and it was exhausting.
And Stephanie. She's a former D1 athlete who knew she couldn't outtrain her diet, and she lost 38 pounds.
My relationship to food before Noom was never consistent.
And Evan, he can't stand salads, but he still lost 50 pounds with Noom.
I never really was a salad guy. That's just not who I am. Even through the pickiness, Noom taught me that building better habits builds a healthier lifestyle. I'm not doing this to get to a number. I'm doing this to feel better.
Get your personalized plan today at Noom.com. Real Noom users compensated to provide their story. In 4 weeks, the typical Noom user can expect to lose 1 to 2 pounds per week. Individual results may vary.
Why get all your holiday decorations delivered through Instacart? Because maybe you only bought 2 wreaths, but you have 12 windows. Or maybe your toddler got very eager with the advent calendar. Or maybe the inflatable snowman didn't make it through the snowstorm. Or maybe the twinkle lights aren't twinkling. Whatever the reason, this season, Instacart's here for hosts and their whole holiday haul. Get decorations from the Home Depot, CVS, and more through Instacart and enjoy free delivery on your first 3 orders. Service fees and terms apply.
I'm Christy Shriver, and we're here to discuss books that have changed the world and have changed us.
And I'm Gary Shriver, and this is the How to Love Lit podcast. Last episode, we introduced a writer from the part of the world where Christy and I lived, the American Mid-South. As many of you know, we live in Memphis, Tennessee, and Memphis is located on the Mississippi River on the border between Tennessee and Mississippi and Arkansas. If you were to fly into the Memphis International Airport, rent a car, drive south through the country down Old Highway 7 or 385 for about 70 miles, you'll find yourself in Oxford, Mississippi, the hometown of William Faulkner. Oxford technically is not part of what we call the Mississippi Delta, but the rural flavor and the rows of cotton that you'll see on the drive there reminds you of Faulkner's Jefferson, and it's right around the corner of our imagination.
Well, you know, Oxford today is really a nice place. I mean, they have a town square. It's peppered with restaurants and bookstores and ice cream parlors, all built in that traditional Southern architecture. Ole Miss, the nickname for the University of Mississippi, has an impressive football stadium and a stately campus, and it's just a few miles away from the downtown area. There's thousands of students that you can find from all over the world chanting "Hotty Toddy" at their SEC sporting events like football and baseball and track. So to be so far out in the country, it's amazing that it's also home to more than just a couple of American literary powerhouses. I mean, one recognizable modern author you may know is John Grisham. I mean, he's written lots of books that have been turned into movies.
Yes. And, the last episode, we introduced Faulkner's personal and professional life, most of which was lived right there in Oxford. Although he would travel quite a bit after becoming famous, he never stayed away too long from the town that he knew really well. And, of course, the town knew him and often aided and abetted his propensity to stretch the truth, concealing much about his personal life from the public. And it's funny for sure, but as you read the stories he told about himself, it's not a far jump into his imagination and the world of Yoknapatawpha County, a story world which is very much an imagined representation, or perhaps, just an exaggerated conflation of his home. But last episode, we entered Jefferson, the county seat of Yoknapatawpha County, and there met one of its most august citizens after her funeral, Mrs. Emily Grierson.
That would be Miss. By reading part one of Faulkner's famous story, A Rose for Emily, we learn quite a bit about the values and culture of this old Southern world. 1930, the year the story was published, and presumably when the narrator first related this tale, is very much a world where the Civil War is not ancient history, but the story about Grandma and Grandpa.
True. And Christy, it's hard for us to imagine this world where Confederate uniforms were still hanging in Grandpa's closet and they make an appearance on occasions such as funerals. But in this reality, the young African-American servant in the story would have been the son of a former slave, and where Emily's father would have likely been his owner. And if the dates of the story are to be recreated, which is no small task, but if we could count backwards from the only given date in the text, what we see is that Emily would have been born in 1854, which is a full decade before the end of the Civil War. And, of course, readers in Faulkner's day would have been keenly aware of this. But for us who also look backwards in time, like a meadow, it's more than a timeline. Sometimes this context is difficult to really kind of understand.
Yes, and so this, of course, is the political setting of the story. I mean, this story, by being set in the post-Civil War South, is set within a context of a white culture. It's struggling with reconciling a past that is full of brokenness. I mean, the people in the story have pride, and we can see it, but it's the pride of a financially destitute, subjugated white population who lost a war but struggled to give up the aristocracy which elevated them above another subjugated population who, in theory, have been freed, but they're still immersed in the poverty of the American South. This story is told by a member of such a group. The narrator is unnamed, likely a contemporary of Emily's, but perhaps not of such high social status as the Griersons. He or she is certainly a town resident who's followed the story for years, but maybe from a distance. But maybe not. Maybe the narrator is one of those shafted suitors. I've wondered if it's the pharmacist. I mean, we are left to guess. There's certainly no intimacy between the narrator and Emily. I mean, there's not even a friendly sort of intimacy. There are no tears at Emily's funeral, and that's by anyone. Emily is not beloved. She's not even liked. And yet someone, possibly even the narrator himself, has kept a watchful eye over Emily all these years. The town in many ways has taken care of her as an obligation or a curiosity, or perhaps like you would take care of a pitiful animal that you see wandering alone but don't really care enough to take in. Somebody even organized the funeral and rounded up attendees. And so from the funeral, we will go back in time. Let's pick it up in part 2.
So she vanquished them, horse and foot, just as she had vanquished their fathers 30 years before about the smell. There were 2 years after her father's death, and a short time after her sweetheart, the one we believe would marry her, had deserted her. After her father's death, she went out very little, and after her sweetheart went away, people hardly saw her at all. A few of the ladies had the temerity to call, but were not received, and the only sign of life about the place was the Negro man, a young man then, going in and out with a market basket.
Of course, part 2 starts with Emily vanquishing the town people who came to collect her taxes. I mean, it's quite a strong word. Of course, it's a word that connotes authority when Emily obviously has none. But with it, she takes the reader backwards in time 30 years previous, depending on how long it was from Emily's death to when the narrator retells the story. But we can presume that we've gone back to in or around 1886 from 1930. At that point, Emily's father would have been dead about 2 years, and Homer the sweetheart had himself vanquished.
Well, I want to bring up the male servant, who's the only other constant in the story. At this point, he's described as a young man. He's also referenced as a Negro, which in the original is capitalized. And this would have been the most respectful term for an African American at the time that Faulkner is writing the story.
You know, Gary, let's read this dialogue back and forth. I'll be the community voices, and you can be Judge Stevens.
Okay.
Just as if any man could keep a kitchen properly, the lady said. So they were not surprised when the smell developed. It was another link between the gross, teeming world of the high and mighty Griersons. A neighbor, a woman, complained to the mayor, Judge Stevens, 80 years old.
But what will you have me to do about it, madam, he said.
Why, send her word to stop it, the woman said. Isn't there a law?
I'm sure that won't be necessary, Judge Stevens said. It's probably just a snake or a rat that man of hers killed in the yard. I'll speak to him about it.
The next day he received 2 more complaints, one from a man who came in diffident deprecation. We really must do something about it, Judge. I'd be the last one in the world to bother Miss Emily, but we've got to do something. That night, the Board of Aldermen met, 3 graybeards and 1 young man, a member of the rising generation. It's simply enough, he said. Send her word to have her place cleaned up. Give her a certain time to do it, and if she don't...
Damn it, sir, Judge Stevens said, will you accuse a lady to her face of smelling bad?
So the next night, after midnight, 4 men crossed Miss Emily's lawn and slunk about the house like burglars, sniffing along the base of the brickwork and at the cellar openings, while one of them performed a regular sewing motion with his hand out of a sack slung from his shoulder. They broke open the cellar door and sprinkled lime there and in all the outbuildings. As they recrossed the lawn, a window that had been dark was lighted, and Miss Emily sat in it, the light behind her and her upright torso motionless as that of an idol. They crept quietly across the lawn and into the shadow of the locusts that lined the street. After a week or 2, the smell went away. That was when people had begun to really feel sorry for her. People in our town, remembering how old Lady Wyatt, her great-aunt, had gone completely crazy at last, believed that the Griersons held themselves a little too high for what they really were. None of the young men were quite good enough for Miss Emily and such. We had long thought of them as a tableau. Miss Emily, a slender figure in white in the background, her father, a spraddled silhouette in the foreground, his back to her and clutching a horsewhip, the 2 of them framed by the back-flung front door. So when she got to be 30 and was still single, we were not pleased exactly, but vindicated. Even with insanity in the family, she wouldn't have turned down all of her chances if they really materialized.
You know, from a psychological perspective as well as a political one, this description of the Griersons is really filled with a lot of symbolism. I mean, first of all, Emily has gone from being a monument to being an idol to being a tableau. I mean, in the mind of her father, at least, none of the boys were good enough for her, and maybe even including the narrator himself, who seems almost pleased that she's not found a beau. And his insistence of being better than everyone in town also meant that he has completely isolated his daughter from all of society. I mean, she's alone. Also notice the change in description from part 1 to part 2. She's gone from being a grotesquely obese woman in black in part 1 to a slender figure in white in part 2. And secondly, I mean, look at Emily's father. he's clutching a horsewhip, which is a sign of violence. And as we will see, as the story evolves, there's an element of sexual repression on the part of the father, and this horsewhip seems to represent this. And of course, critics don't agree to what extent he's responsible for what we see emerge in the storyline, but there's no doubt in my mind that he shares much of it.
Well, I want to bring up Emily's age. I mean, of course, today, not getting married until you're 30 is quite normal. But in my grandmother's day, which was still a couple of generations removed from Emily, this would be embarrassing, especially among that class of people. Now, my grandmother on my father's side was a very Southern lady raised in Spring Hill, Louisiana, and she attended the University of Arkansas, which in the late 30s was when she went there. During the American Depression, very few men attended university at that time, much less women. By the way, by contrast, my grandmother on my mother's side, she graduated only from the 8th grade and then went to work, which was more the norm. Anyway, my grandmother, the one who went to the university in Arkansas, joined a sorority and signed up to get a major in home economics. And I want to say that not one of her sorority sisters, at least none that I met, graduated with a degree at all of any kind. All of them dropped out and got married to a college boy before they finished. In other words, before they were 21. So you can imagine not just the pressure, but also the shame if you don't have a husband by age 30. I mean, if you're a person at the top of the social ladder, it would be quite the conversation. Miss Emily Grierson knew that. No wonder she didn't go outside. I mean, how could she? It'd be embarrassing.
When her father died, it got about that the house was all that was left to her, and in a way, people were glad. At last they could pity Miss Emily. Being left alone and a pauper, she had become humanized. Now she too would know the old thrill and the old despair of a penny more or less. The day after his death, all the ladies prepared to call at the house and offer condolence and aid, as is our custom. Miss Emily met them at the door, dressed as usual and with no trace of grief on her face. She told them that her father was not dead. She did that for 3 days, with the ministers calling on her and the doctors trying to persuade her to let them dispose of the body. Just as they were about to resort to law and force, she broke down and they buried her father quickly. We did not say she was crazy then. We believed that she had to do that. We remembered all the young men her father had driven away, and we knew that with nothing left, she would have to cling to that which had robbed her, as people will.
I want to point out that we see in a more obvious way that this story is very much about the meaning of time. I mean, the meaning of the passage of time. Emily here is absolutely trying to vanquish time the way she vanquished the neighbors and the way her father had vanquished her suitors. She just wants to make it not so. Faulkner says she wanted to cling to that which had robbed her. That phrase itself is interesting because he uses a pronoun without a predecessor. Who robbed her? Did her father rob her? Did death? For 3 days she holds out. But as her father does not raise from the dead, she is obligated to let the neighbors bury him. She's been robbed by both death and her father.
And I want to bring up, if Emily is in some symbolic sense, which I think is an interesting way to read the story, if she is a symbol of the Old South and its social hierarchy, her refusal to accept the reality that time has moved on is really a grotesque criticism of the Southern aristocracy at large. I mean, her house is out of place and Gothic. Her father is in the ground. The authority that gave her special status and dispensed her taxes has long been dead. I mean, the world of Emily Grierson is dead, and it too has betrayed her.
Part 3. She was sick for a long time. When we saw her again, her hair was cut short, making her look like a girl with a vague resemblance to those angels in colored church windows, sort of tragic and serene. The town had just let the contracts for paving the sidewalks, and in the summer after her father's death, they began the work. The construction company came with men and mules and machinery and foreman named Homer Barron, a Yankee, a big, dark, ruddy man with a big voice and eyes lighter than his face. The little boys would follow in groups to hear him cuss the African-American men and the African-Americans singing in time to the rise and fall of pigs. Pretty soon he knew everybody in town. Whenever you heard a lot of laughing anywhere about the square, Homer Barron would be in the center of the group. Presently, we began to see him and Miss Emily on Sunday afternoons driving in the yellow-wheeled buggy and the matched team of bays from the livery stable. At first, we were glad that Miss Emily would have an interest because the ladies all said, of course, a Grierson would not think seriously of a Northerner, a day laborer. But there were still others, older people, who said that even grief could not cause a real lady to forget noblesse oblige, without calling it noblesse oblige. They just said, poor Emily, her kinfolk should come to her. She had kin in Alabama, but years ago her father had fallen out with them over the estate of old Lady Wyatt, the crazy woman, and there was no communication between the two families. They had not even been represented at the funeral. As soon as the old people said, poor Emily, the whispering began. Do you suppose it's really so? They said to one another. Of course it is. Why else could... This behind their hands, rustling of crane silk and satin behind jalousies, closed up upon the sun of Sunday afternoon as the thin, swift clop, clop, clop of the match team passed. Poor Emily.
I referenced the social hierarchy being the context, really, of the political interpretation of the story. And if you had not been able to see it up until now with Faulkner's use of derogatory language in reference to African Americans, it's really impossible to overlook. Right there, we see this stratified city bringing in outsiders who they look down on, ironically, to modernize it. But they are not just outsiders. They are bringing African Americans and Northerners, or Yankees, as it would be called. These people are viewed by the town at large, including the narrator, as lowbrow and beneath them all. And Emily is not the only one who's refusing to let go of that social hierarchy. I mean, the town is as well. And according to the town, she has noblesse oblige, which, of course, is a French phrase that means a responsibility one has because of one's privileged status. And in this case, her obligation is not to associate with those lower than herself. And I would like to add, when I first came to the South, quite often I heard the phrase, "You're not from around here, are you?"
Well, did they have their noblesse oblige, or did they deign to speak with you?
By the way, I did not realize that being from Missouri would make me a Yankee. But,
yes.
But I digress.
Well, this is William Faulkner really at his best, making fun of this entire social system. I mean, the irony of looking down all those that are modernizing your community. I mean, the irony of Emily with all this noblesse oblige. She's the poorest member of the entire community. The idea that the community, not just her, but the community believes that she should look down on anyone is absurd. Except in the context of the Old South, I mean, it makes total sense. I mean, she's poor, she has nothing, but we will pretend that this is not the case. Faulkner loves his people, but he also knows absurd when he sees it.
He does. She carried her head high enough, even when we believed that she was fallen. It was as if she demanded more than ever the recognition of her dignity as the last Grierson, as if it had wanted that touch of earthiness to reaffirm her imperviousness. Like when she bought the rat poison, the arsenic. That was over a year after they had begun to say, "Poor Emily," and while the two female cousins were visiting her. "I want some poison," she said to the druggist. She was over 30 then, still a slight woman, though thinner than usual, with cold, haughty black eyes and a face the flesh of which was strained across the temples and about the eye sockets, as you imagine a lighthouse keeper's face ought to look. "I want some poison," she said. "Yes, Miss Emily, what kind? For rats and such? I want the best you have. I don't care what kind." The druggist named several. "They'll kill anything up to an elephant, but what you want is..." "Arsenic," Miss Emily said. "Is that a good one?" "Is arsenic?" "Yes, ma'am. But what you want?" "I want arsenic." The druggist looked down at her. She looked back at him, erect, her face like a strained flag. Why, of course, the druggist said, if that's what you want, but the law requires you to tell me what you're going to use it for. Miss Emily just stared at him, her head tilted back in order to look him eye for eye until he looked away and went and got the arsenic and wrapped it up. The Negro delivery boy brought her the package. The druggist didn't come back. When she opened the package at home, there was written on the box, under the skull and crossbones, 4 rats.
So he lies. And we see again that the town protects Emily. I mean, they allow her not to pay her taxes. They allow her to illegally buy arsenic. And this is what makes me wonder what this narrator knows and how he knows it.
Well, good point. And I want to point out that phrase, she carried her head high enough, even when we believed that she was fallen. You know, of course, fallen is the old-fashioned word for a woman who has had sex outside the confines of marriage. And in this case, they believe Emily is associated with Homer Barron, you know, a man beneath her station. But it's worse. She has fallen, a Southern lady with a Northern day laborer. I mean, a Yankee. What could be worse? And another irony, there are 2 things in this world that force the destruction of any social hierarchy, and they are sex and death. I mean, you can marry up, you can marry down. Sex destroys the hierarchy, but so does death. And in that, we are all alike, you know, from dust to dust. And Emily seems to be rebelling against that hierarchy that's betrayed her.
Part 4. So the next day we all said, she will kill herself. And we said it would be the best thing. When she had first begun to be seen with Homer Barron, we had said, she will marry him. Then we said, she will persuade him yet, because Homer himself had remarked he liked men, and it was known that he drank with the younger men in the Elks Club, that he was not a marrying man. Later, we said, poor Emily, behind the jalousies as they passed on Sunday afternoon in the glittering buggy. Miss Emily with her head high and Homer Barron with his hat cocked with a cigar in his teeth, reins and whip and a yellow glove. Then some of the ladies began to say that it was a disgrace to the town and a bad example to the young people. The men did not want to interfere, but at last the ladies forced the Baptist minister, Miss Emily's people were Episcopal, to call upon her. He would never divulge what happened during that interview, but he refused to go back again. The next Sunday, they again drove about the streets, and the following day, the minister's wife wrote to Miss Emily's relations in Alabama.
You know, it's so funny that the town thinks that it might be for the best that she kills herself, as if that would be better than marrying the Yankee. I mean, I wonder who it would be best for. I mean, for the town. It's also funny that all of these progressive people who are supposedly democratic are actively working to maintain this social hierarchy of the South by calling in relatives from Alabama, the reinforcements, you know, to remind Emily of her place in society.
You know, and it's more than the fact that he's a Northerner and a day laborer. He drinks with young men. He likes men. He is not a marrying man. I mean, these are all euphemisms suggesting that they thought Homer Barron was gay.
You know, the euphemism of that day would have been a confirmed bachelor.
Confirmed, yes, it seems so. And so in response to that, they summon the Baptist minister, even though she's Episcopalian. This, of course, is an inside joke for those of us who are Protestant, because if there is a cliche within Protestant circles, it is the understanding that Baptists are the most meddlesome of all the Christian denominations, and that a Baptist minister is the most meddlesome of all Christian ministers. But the very idea that she was successful at vanquishing a Baptist minister speaks well to her powers. I mean, no one vanquishes the Baptists. I mean, that's the inside joke.
Wow. So she had bloodkin under her roof again, and we sat back to watch developments. At first, nothing happened. Then we were sure that they were to be married. We learned that Miss Emily had been to the jeweler's and ordered a man's toilet set in silver with the letters HB on each piece. 2 days later, we learned that she had bought a complete outfit of men's clothing, including a nightshirt, and we said, they are married. We were really glad. We were glad because the two female cousins were even more Grierson than Miss Emily had ever been. So we were not surprised when Homer Barron, the streets had been finished for some time since, was gone. We were a little disappointed that there was not a public blowing off, but we believed that he had gone on to prepare for Miss Emily's coming or to give her a chance to get rid of the cousins. By that time, it was a cabal, and we were all Miss Emily's allies to help circumvent the cousins. Sure enough, after another week they departed, and as we had expected all along, within 3 days, Homer Barron was back in town. A neighbor saw the Negro man admit him at the kitchen door at dusk one evening. And that was the last we saw of Homer Barron, and of Miss Emily for some time. The Negro man went in and out with the market basket, but the front door remained closed. Now and then we would see her at a window for a moment, as the men did that night when they sprinkled the lime, but for almost 6 months she did not appear on the streets. Then we knew that this was to be expected too, as if that quality of her father which had thwarted her woman's life so many times had been too virulent and too furious to die.
Presumably, if we're going to keep up with the chronology, this would have been around 1886, 2 years after her father's death. What we also see is the town interfering once again to protect Emily. Once again, her house stinks, but instead of confronting her, they remove the smell of death by covering it up. Emily is moving from being the girl in white to being the girl in black. She also seems to be morphing into a version of her father. It was as if her father's influence had been too virulent to die. It transferred to her. It's also worth mentioning that the house that had once been white is in decay.
When we saw Miss Emily next, she had grown fat and her hair was turning gray. During the next few years, it grew grayer and grayer until it attained an even pepper and salt iron gray when it ceased turning. Up to the day of her death at 74, it was still that vigorous iron gray like the hair of an active man. From that time on, her front door remained closed, save for a period of 6 or 7 years when she was about 40, during which she gave lessons in china painting. She fitted up a studio in one of the downstairs rooms where the daughters and granddaughters of Colonel Sartor's contemporaries were sent to her with the same regularity and in the same spirit that they were sent to church on Sundays with a 25-cent piece for the collection plate. Meanwhile, her taxes had been remitted.
Let me point out that her hair is described as that of an active man. Like I said, we are seeing some signs that she is her father's daughter. But also notice again the community intervening to rescue Emily. They send their daughters to suffer through china painting lessons. She's compared to the obligation of putting a quarter into the offering plate at church.
Then the newer generation became the backbone and the spirit of the town, and the painting pupils grew up and fell away and did not send their children to her with boxes of color and tedious brushes and pictures cut from the ladies' magazines. The front door closed upon the last one and remained closed for good. When a town got free postal delivery, Miss Emily alone refused to let them fasten the metal numbers above her door and attach a mailbox to it. She would not listen to them. Daily, monthly, yearly, we watched the Negro grow grayer and more stooped, going in and out with the market basket. Each December, we sent her a tax notice which would be returned by the post office a week later, unclaimed. Now and then we would see her in one of the downstairs windows. She had evidently shut up the top floor of the house, like the carven torso of an idol in a niche. Looking or not looking at us, we could never tell which. Thus she passed from generation to generation, dear, inescapable, impervious, tranquil, and perverse. And so she died. Fell ill in a house filled with dust and shadows, with only a doddering Negro man to wait on her. We did not even know she was sick. We had long since given up trying to give up any information from the Negro. He talked to no one, probably not even to her, for his voice had grown harsh and rusty as if from disuse. She died in one of the downstairs rooms in a heavy walnut bed with a curtain, her gray head propped on a pillow, yellow and moldy with age and lack of sunlight.
Once again, she's compared to an idol, but this is not an idol that you look up to, but an idol that looks down on us. From a narrative plot perspective, it's interesting that Emily's death is the occasion for the opening of the story. It's an event in the fourth section of the story, and of course, it's the subject of the final section we're about to read. This story centers around death, Emily's death. It's about decay. But how can we explain this final turn of events?
Part 5. The Negro met the first of the ladies at the front door and let them in with their hushed, sibilant voices and their quick, curious glances, and then he disappeared. He walked right through the house and out the back door and was not seen again. The two female cousins came at once. They held the funeral on the second day, with the town coming to look at Miss Emily beneath a mass of bought flowers with the crayon face of her father musing profoundly above the bier, and the ladies sibilant and macabre and the very old men, some in their brushed Confederate uniforms, on the porch and lawn, talking of Miss Emily as if she had been a contemporary of theirs, believing that they had danced with her and courted her perhaps, confusing time with its mathematical progression as the old do, to whom all the past is not a diminishing road, but instead a huge meadow which no winter ever quite touches, divided from them now by the narrow bottleneck of the most recent decade of years. Already we knew that there was one room in that region above stairs which no one had seen in 40 years, and which would have to be forced. They waited until Miss Emily was decently in the ground before they opened it. The violence of breaking down the door seemed to fill this room with pervading dust.
It's just ironic that we're using violence here. I mean, did someone know something? It reminds me of a crime scene movie. I mean, what's the need of breaking down the door of someone who's already dead? I mean, if you can't open it, why not just take the door off the hinges? Who does this? But more importantly, why?
A thin, acrid pall as of the tomb seemed to lie everywhere upon this room, decked and furnished as for a bridal. Upon the valance, curtains of faded rose color, upon the rose-shaded lights, upon the dressing table, upon the delicate array of crystal, and the man's toilet things backed with tarnished silver, silver so tarnished that the monogram was obscured. Among them lay a collar and tie, as if they had just been removed, which left upon the surface a pale crescent in the dust. Upon a chair hung the suit, carefully folded, beneath it the two mute shoes and the discarded socks. The man himself lay in the bed. For a long while we just stood there, looking down at the profound and fleshless grin. The body had apparently once lain in the attitude of an embrace, but now the long sleep that outlasts love, that conquers even a grimace of love, had cuckolded him. What was left of him, rotted beneath what was left of the nightshirt, had become inextricably from the bed in which he lay, and upon him and upon the pillow beside him lay that even coating of the patient and biting dust. Then we noticed that in the second pillow was the indentation of a head. One of us lifted something from it, and leaning forward, that faint and invisible dust, dry and acrid in the nostrils, we saw a long strand of iron gray hair.
You know, when you read that, you have to just pause for a second, reread it, and then pause again.
You were in just as much shock as they were when they broke into the room.
I know. It's that final sentence that puts the whole story into place. I mean, Emily and Homer Barron go upstairs supposedly to consummate some sort of union. Emily kills Homer Barron with the arsenic. Emily is in an act of final defiance, seeks to vanquish death, but in so doing rebels against any moral training she had ever received. I mean, she betrayed her own moral instructions by having sex. She betrayed her own sense of moral upbringing by murdering, but that's not enough. She goes farther. She will not bury Barron. Barron is lying in a position of embrace. He's not flat on his
That
back.
doubles the creepiness.
I mean, she physically, literally does not let go, even in the face of death. Barron, nor anyone, tells her no. He will not leave her, and she sleeps with him from age 30 until some time when her hair turns iron gray. It didn't even matter that he was dead.
Well, and so we have, among other things, a grotesque picture of a person, a community, and a people that cannot accept the passage of time, to put it mildly.
Right, if you're going to think of this story as personal or political or symbolic. And yet, the title, it's empathetic. It's full of sympathy, a rose for Emily. As the aggressor, there is a sense that she is still a victim. Literally, a victim of a system that made her a monster. Faulkner, as we mentioned last week, published this short story in 1930, not too long after his masterpiece, The Sound and the Fury. He got paid for A Rose for Emily, which, as I think we mentioned, was better than his novels were doing. They weren't selling well at all, and by 1946, Faulkner's work was almost entirely out of print, and he would have been forgotten had it not been for the French critics who recognized his genius. André Malraux wrote a preface for Sanctuary, and the existentialist Jean-Paul Sartre wrote a long critical essay on Faulkner. These two men, who carried substantial weight in the literary community, drew attention to Faulkner, and things began to change, and lo and behold, by 1950, he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature. Just incredible. Faulkner and his daughter Jill went to Sweden to receive the award, and while there, he gave a Nobel Speech Prize that was highly regarded. This led him to become a public figure. He began to travel the world representing the U.S., and finally, his prints, his novels, became financially successful.
His life seems a very traditional rags to riches, happily ever after kind of story when you put it neatly into a paragraph. But of course, just like the characters that he eloquently wrote about, that's really not the full story. I mean, his personal story is very conflicted, from his relationship with Estelle to the various children he raised to the way he went out to Hollywood to make money, to his relationship with whiskey, to his relationship with the public in general.
Well, that's true. When the portable Faulkner came out, which is the paper copies of his book, his finances did improve, and that helped. And after the Nobel Prize made him famous, he became this attaché. But the problem was he didn't like all that attention. He was never comfortable in front of a microphone, and a couple times got himself in real trouble by things he said.
Well, on July 6th, 1962, Faulkner fell while riding a horse around his home, and he'd had a lifelong affection for horses, and he was badly injured. He was taken to the hospital, and a few weeks later, he died by thrombosis, which is something that happens when blood clots form in the heart. And the complications of his thrombosis were not certainly a result not just of the fall, but really mostly of his alcoholism.
And so Faulkner, so famously known for depicting life as raw and passionate, dies from complications brought on by a lifestyle and accident, all rolled up in one. Someone say it's just another bit of Southern irony.
So there you go. Faulkner lived his own Faulkner-esque lifestyle. And I'm sure that irony would not have been lost on him should he be watching. Well, thank you all for listening. We hope you've enjoyed this introduction of Faulkner. If you have, please check us out on our other episodes in our website, howtoloveLitPodcast.com. Don't forget to share this episode or any episode with a friend. It's when you share that we grow. Thank you for helping us in our mission to make great literature accessible to anyone around the globe.
Peace out.
Selling a little or a lot? Shopify helps you do your thing however you cha-ching. Shopify is the global commerce platform that helps you sell at every stage of your business. From the launch your online shop stage to the first real-life store stage, all the way to the did we just hit a million orders stage. Shopify is there to help you grow. Shopify helps you turn browsers into buyers with the internet's best converting checkout. 36% better on average compared to other leading commerce platforms. Because businesses that grow, grow with Shopify. Get a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/work. Shopify.com/work.
Oh my God, it's the coolest thing ever. Hey guys, have you heard of Goldbelly? Well, check this out. It's this amazing site where they ship the most iconic famous foods from restaurants across the country anywhere nationwide. I've never found a more perfect gift than food. They ship Chicago deep dish pizza, New York bagels, Maine lobster rolls, and even Ina Garten's famous cakes. Seriously. So if you're looking for a gift for the food lover in your life, head to goldbelly.com and get 20% off your first order with promo code GIFT.
This is a mini meditation guided by Bombas. Repeat after me. I'm comfy, comfy. I'm cozy, cozy. I have 0 blisters on my toes. Blisters. And that's because I wear Bombas, the softest socks, underwear, and t-shirts that give back. One purchased equals one donated. Now go to bombas.com/ACAST and use code ACAST for 20% off your first purchase. That's BOMBAS.com/ACAST and use code ACAST at checkout.